Good morning. You're watching a home broadcast of Business World Live. I'm Danie Laurel. It's 10:30 a.m. this Tuesday morning here in Metro Manila. We are about an hour into the shortened trading day. Let's go straight to our top story. Manufacturing activity continued to decline, but at a softer pace in the month of May. That's as the lockdown disrupted the operations of manufacturing firms. The IHS market said the country's headline purchasing managers index, or the PMI, rose to 40.1, that's in May, from a record low of 31.6 in the month of April. IHS market said this was due to the easing of measures in some regions, which helped the rate of contraction of production soften from April. But IHS economist David Owen said conditions have still not recovered, with restrictions in the NCR and other cities broadly the same since the month of April, which in part led to sharp fall in new volume orders. Metro Manila was placed under an enhanced community quarantine, or ECQ, for over 2 months since March 15. It then shifted to a more relaxed general community quarantine on June 1st. Now, despite the improvement, the reading still pointed to a sharp deterioration. That's according to market. A reading below 50 signals contraction, while a figure above 50 denotes improvement. The headline PMI is based on 5 indices: new orders, output, employment, suppliers, delivery time, and stocks of purchases. IHS also said the capacity of factories was still lower than the normal in the month of May as companies implemented physical distancing measures. It also said businesses were reluctant to increase output as new orders remained very weak. Employment also fell as firms operated on a skeletal workforce. Other economies in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand and Vietnam, recorded a rebound in manufacturing from the record lows seen in April, but still remained in the contraction level. Capital Economics says the PMI readings across emerging Asia may not accurately reflect the change in the industry conditions last month, but they are still indicative of the fact that output remains very depressed. ING Bank senior economist Nikki Mapa said the improvement in May is still a welcome sign that output and orders rebounded from April, which he says could signal a start of the recovery and one step towards expansion. But blue chip companies in the country are scrambling to rewrite revival plans because of the coronavirus crisis. For instance, you've got MPIC Chair Manny Pangilinan saying they are halving 2020 capex to 80 billion pesos. That's as the company cuts investments in new ventures such as hospitality and logistics. You can see on your screens right now the blue chips cutting 2020 capex amid the COVID-19 crisis. Jollibee, on the other hand, cutting capex to 5 billion pesos from the original 14 billion pesos. Meanwhile, Ayala Land told stockholders that it was reducing spending to 70 billion pesos from 110 billion pesos. ICTSI is also slashing its capex from $400 million to $100 million. And there's also Aboitiz, which cut spending to 47 billion pesos from the original 73 billion pesos. JG Summit doing the same from 82 to 58 billion pesos. Jervin DeCellis, a trader at Timson Securities, says cutting capex may be the only way for companies to stay afloat amid this crisis. Meanwhile, Union Bank's chief economist, Carlos Asuncion, says some sectors may find it difficult to adapt to the, quote, new normal. Let's open my terminal together. There's so much stock-related news that we need to get through, but I did want to kick off broad and global here. Let's take a quick peek at my screen here. I'm going to take out the global indices just to check in on how Wall Street had performed overnight. You're going to be seeing a bit of green. That's after a mixed performance on Friday. Recall, there's still a lot of social unrest going on over in the U.S. amid the death of George Floyd in the hands of U.S. police. This is actually the 7th day yesterday of unrest in New York City, which now has a curfew. Donald Trump has announced he may be deploying military, and this actually comes amid the fact that U.S. manufacturing, we had reported the Philippine manufacturing index also still contracting, but U.S. manufacturing rose in May for the first time in 4 months. Global stocks are actually trading at a 3-month high as businesses start reopening around the world. And this is what analysts say are being priced in. They're calling this a disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. You can see in my terminals here how Asia is opening, still largely in the green. This follows a rally that we did see on Monday morning on the 1st of June. So not a bad showing here. Let's kick off with our local markets and see whether we managed to extend those gains that we've seen. And take a look at that, our 3-day chart, a very nice sort of uphill battle here. We're actually up by close to 8% in just the past 3 days. And take a look at that, guys. We are opening above 6,000 levels this morning. That is monumental. 6,013.49. That is a strong increase of 1.4%. That's following another increase that we saw on Monday morning, up by 1.6%. And analysts had said that we might actually be breaking into 6,000 levels. That seems to be happening right now. Let's hope we manage to stay afloat throughout the rest of the shortened trading day. Luis Lumlingan is saying that another bright spot that might be happening is that a lot of investors are actually seeing the Philippines as being less risky as opposed to our other neighbors. For instance, he did mention all of the unrest that's happening in Hong Kong that might have an impact on that economy, might be bringing our foreign funds back here into the Philippines. And in fact, we did see quite strong value turnovers yesterday. That's close to 7 billion pesos, even if that's significantly lower than the 20 billion peso of trading worth that we had seen on Friday. But still, net foreign buying yesterday, second straight day. But there are a lot of issues to be parsing through, especially when we go stock specific, because you do have a slew of earnings that are nevertheless far from stellar. Let's kick off with Shakey's, though, that had just released their first quarter earnings. And you can see on your screens here, revenues at 1.83 billion pesos in the first quarter, but net income slumping by 35% to 114 million pesos. And they said this was on the back of them having actually reported system-wide sales growth of 21% in the first 2 quarters of the month. And that was completely erased by the implementation of the quarantine restrictions in March rather. And that actually made their network slump. They only had 9% of their 290 stores operational during this enhanced community quarantine in the month of March. And they expect the second quarter to be significantly worse, and quote, possibly the most challenging I've experienced in my career. This from their CEO, Vicente Gregorio. However, they did mention some 91% or 256 stores are actually already operational. So again, challenging first quarter for Shakey's and more pain ahead. Another one is Phoenix Petroleum, swinging to 215 million pesos of a net loss in the first quarter. That is versus a net profit that they saw in the same period of last year of 415 million pesos. They're saying that their volumes were actually down 5%. And the revenues down by 9%. So a lot of things that analysts have said caused this for Phoenix Petroleum. I'll pull that out for you guys. But they did mention this from Jafet Tantiangco of Philstocks, just a general lower oil demand from all of these closures. You've also got the transport industry, of course, not operational during the second part of March. But you've also got, for instance, the Taal volcano eruption that happened in January, and also just a lower price of oil that was being seen. But Dennis Uy, who of course heads Phoenix Petroleum, does say that their portfolio today is more diversified. They said LPG is particularly thriving in this pandemic. It's now actually an essential item in the kitchen during the ECQ. But interestingly, there is a pivot going on here. They have announced a plan to inject some funds in their property holding unit. So they did get approval from their shareholders to invest 4.9 billion pesos of corporate funds into a wholly owned unit over 3 years. They also got approval from shareholders to form a unit that will operate a road transport business. So venturing into property space as well as infrastructure and roads amid the slump in the revenues received from their distribution of oil. Now, another thing that I want to check in on are the IPOs that we did see in 2019. I'm not sure if anyone still remembers 2019, but nevertheless, we did have 4 IPOs back then. If you had invested in them, it might still take a while for you to be getting your money back. You've got actually Frutas planning to hold back on their expansion And that is actually on the back of them having announced that they're reallocating a part of their 820 million IPO proceeds from last year towards paying down their debt. They've also said that they may be reallocating their capex for plans for 2020, and they're going to be seeing how, of course, the pandemic goes. But one to definitely be watching out for here, Frutas using some of the proceeds of their IPO to pare down the debt. Nevertheless, you can actually see it enjoying a bit of a bump up today. That is up by 5.6% in the first hour of trading amid this announcement. You've also got All Home. Now, they have not yet released their first quarter earnings, but there are some guidance towards what we can expect for that period, especially after they had released their 2019 full year net income, which is at 1.1 billion pesos. They mentioned that that's a doubling of the net income that it had seen in 2018, and that's on the back of revenue shooting up close to 70% to 12.1 billion pesos. They had opened 22 new stores last year, so they now have 45 stores. And Manny Villar, who heads the company, says they're very pleased with the solid performance. Now, as for COVID-19, they said that there is a threat to the supply chain, but the bright spot is that they actually managed to get the cash from the IPO, and that is actually helping them continue with their expansion plans. They're also pivoting into an online shop. And finally, we also have Mary Mart. That's still one IPO hopeful. They did mention, so they had a book building last week. They had just priced their IPO. That's at 1 peso each, and they're planning to raise around 1.6 billion pesos. They said that the demand for their shares was actually 2.07 times oversubscribed. Now, what are they banking on? This is, of course, in Japsia's company. They're banking on the outbreak having, depressed the lease rates. So they say that once the outbreak is, the lockdowns are lifted and things go back to normal, it might actually be cheaper for them to be rolling out their expansion plans given the abundance of available prime commercial spaces, and get this, an increased pool of quality talent. So they are targeting to have 23 stores by this October 2020, up from the 7 operating outlets now. So going, bucking the negativity here, them being very, very optimistic. And one last that I do need to report on, that SunTrust. That is on a trading halt until, that was on a trading halt until 10 p.m. And I can actually see on my terminal here how that has opened with a bump up of 14.8%. Take a look at that. That had already climbed up yesterday, but now is seeing double-digit returns. And that's on the back of them having announced earlier on that their parent Fortune Noble will be buying 7.3 billion pesos of zero coupon convertible bonds. So this will actually help develop the SunTrust hotel and casino project along Manila Bay. So a lot of things to be digesting here for the markets. We will be checking back in on that broadly with our guest later on, Hansika. Okay, let's check in on other headlines we're watching this morning. Just give me a couple of minutes to scroll down. Okay, let's get to it. It's still not business as usual, despite, despite the downgraded lockdowns. At least that's for the electronics industry. Electronic firms under the group SAPI said that while their employees are ready to go back to work, disruptions in supply shipments continue to be a bit of a problem. SAPI says demand for consumer products such as mobile phones fell slightly and is offset by demand in other areas. The group said multinational companies have since moved some of their manufacturing to other countries, while facilities in the Philippines were on minimal operations. SAPI is now hoping to recover once supply chains and manpower start to normalize. The group, which is as well as the IBPAP and PSEi, is hoping for an additional 5-year transition period on top of the 4 to 9 years sunset clause under the CREATE bill that is still currently pending at the Senate. The Transportation Department announced that they will add 5 more stations in the Metro Manila subway project. Now, these new stations are located in East Valenzuela, Loton, Senate, NAIA Terminal 3, and Bicutan. The project's existing stations include Quirino Highway, Tandangsora, North Ave, Quezon Ave, East Ave, Anonas, Katipunan, Ortigas, Shaw, Kalayaan Avenue, BGC, and FTI. Transportation Assistant Secretary Goddess Libiran said that Bicutan will be the common station for the subway and the proposed Philippine National Railways Calamba. The Metro Manila subway is one of Duterte's flagship projects. The DOTR plans to begin tunneling works within this year. The government also targets partial operations of 3 stations by the year 2022 and full operations by 2025. Going paperless and contactless, at least that is the goal of this new e-government bill passed at the House committee level. The measure requires the DICT to establish and promote ways to develop electronic government services in the country. Now, this includes a framework to guide and govern ICT systems of all government agencies and corporations, as well as an archives and record management that is completely digitized. The master plan also provides for an online payment system that will allow citizens and businesses to remit payments electronically. But the next question is the infrastructure available to do it? Well, the measure also requires the DICT, the Budget Department, and the DPWH to ensure universal access to high-speed, quality, and affordable internet. This means facilitating the development of network infrastructures across the country. NEDA also supports a plan saying going cashless has allowed e-commerce companies to function during this lockdown period. The Economic Planning Agency is also proposing to tweak the Electronic Commerce Act of 2000 to make it more comprehensive in detailing transactions covered by the law and specifying the rights of consumers. Our central bank governor says our country's lender will play a very crucial role in the recovery process, and lawmakers should not be weakening them. Indeed, the fight to stay resilient seems to be hinged on a capability to go digital. And here to share with us his thoughts on the future of finance, we have with us Hansika Ings, country head. Hi, Hans, and welcome to the broadcast.
Hi, and good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. Now, let's kick off with a reaction to BSP Governor Diokno's remarks with all of these, considerations, especially granting extra powers to the president to defer payments to loans of banks. How strong is our financial system? How big of a risk is contagion in this period? And how much buffers do we actually have in place right now?
Well, I think, first of all, we've come into this crisis, meaning the banking sector, as one of the better capitalized banking systems around not just the region, but around the world. If you recall, there were some comments previously which said that even before all the Basel III, Basel IV requirements were actually supposed to come into play, which essentially meant higher capitalization rates, the Philippines was way ahead in terms of making sure that the banks actually implemented it. So I think the first thing to mention is that we are in a very solid footing. So coming into the pandemic, we have a little bit of maybe an advantage of that. I guess the question is, when you relate it to the statement of Governor Diokno, I guess yesterday, was that he was hoping that the powers that be, I guess in Congress, would not pass any more, let's call it difficult laws that would unduly put a strain in the banking sector, but rather work with the banking sector to try and improve liquidity in the system, as well as ensuring that there's a continuous level of support in both the corporate as well as the individual customers of the financial system.
Okay, so it's a balancing act there, because you're helping corporates pay and have some leeway, but banks also need to finance, their operations. Now, to what extent are you worried that there might actually be a high risk of default if corporates don't tap on the existing liquidity? So, we have had very preemptive monetary policy easing happening, but are you seeing corporates tapping that market, given the fact that there's so much uncertainty on whether they can be repaying those loans in the short term?
Right. I think what we've seen, by the way, is that at least for those who have access to not just the banking sector, but also the capital market, there's been a serious level of activity following the government, following the Republic, going out to the and the Treasury going out to raise funding, that corporates have been doing the same, primarily through debt capital markets issues, as well as maybe drawing down on some lines. I think the risk is for example, the MSMEs who probably have a tighter and maybe more limited access to this capital base and may not have huge buffers, their ability to kind of withstand a prolonged period of economic non-activity will be, I think, the first risk points for the system.
But on the banking side, is there enough risk appetite for banks to be lending to these MSMEs?
Yeah, I think that depends on which institution looks at particular industries, right? As you've seen, part of the issue when you have a pandemic like this is that the risk profiles go a lot higher than normal, and certain industries become a little bit riskier than others in terms of continuous support. What happens is that in a situation like that, is that the risk premia, even though base rates by the Banco Central are a lot lower, a risk premia tend to increase. So it becomes a pricing mechanism game, right? So to the extent that institutions can borrow at the higher level, so maybe in the riskier industry or as perceived by the financial institutions, then I think they will have enough breathing space. But I think let's not forget that even the banking sector has been extremely helpful, even through the Bayanihan Act, in terms of trying to help their own clients, be they corporate or individual borrowers, by basically postponing payments. And I think the ability to at least help manage some of that cash outflow from the borrowers is a positive step.
So what about retail clients? What's your outlook on consumption picking up? What type of recovery are we going to be seeing here? Are people going to be tapping, I don't know, personal consumption loans, buying properties in this period, or is that going to be taking a bit of a hit?
Well, I think clearly, like the level of retail consumer activity is also going to depend on how fast the economy phases in terms of economic activity. And I think, by the way, I should say that the phased-in process is the appropriate process that the government is following. And to the extent that certain jobs are continue to exist, as well as people getting paid in addition to some of the cash transfers, these will obviously help the short-term issues. I think that the demand is actually going to crawl up, not immediately, but in a particular way that I guess both industry and individuals start coming back into the workplace.
Okay, so it all depends on how effectively we manage to do this transition into the new normal, but we do have the money and liquidity sitting there. Now let's move over to digital banking. So this has been a long time goal of the central bank. Most banks have tried to pivot even ahead of this pandemic. To what extent did this pandemic highlight our financial exclusion situation here in the Philippines, and to what extent has it actually improved financial inclusion?
I think in one sense, the pandemic has actually raised the consciousness level that doing things digitally is perhaps the way to go, simply because it's easier. And of course, from actually getting the non-banked into being banked consumers without having to deal with a lot of the issues that maybe the brick and mortar situation presented us. So to a great extent, this helps the Banco Central's effort to actually have a larger financial inclusion, not just policy, but actually bringing in people into the digital fold, or to the banking fold, if you will. I think that what we've seen also is that if you look at the data, both InstaPay and PesoNet data have actually increased when you look at the number of transactions through the pandemic. And that tells you that both corporations, banks, as well as individuals are beginning to see the benefit of actually doing things digitally.
I just want to press you on that because you've been following this for sure very closely, given you guys are the digital bank, even ahead of the pandemic. Are these people that were already in another bank jumping towards digital banks? Are these people previously unbanked now opening new bank accounts? Where is this increase coming from?
It's actually both. And obviously, for those who've had, let's call it your typical brick and mortar account, they've started to shift to digital transactions or their online, at the very least, the transactions from their current bank. In our case, it's obviously been a 100% digital experience. So all of our clients are brand new, and in fact, perhaps surprisingly, or have been surprised at the amount of things you can do even with a basic savings account, from actually onboarding yourself digitally to actually moving funds effortlessly through your mobile phone.
There was a lot of question here on whether you could execute a fully digital bank. You've got the existing traditional banks trying to go digital, but you guys started with that. Are we ready for this? Did we have the internet infrastructure in place, the security infrastructure in place? Now everyone's working from home, and people need to make calls and transactions all from their homes. Give us an idea of whether we were able to, even before this pandemic, we were able already to harness all of these infrastructure in the right way.
Well, first of all, I would say that us starting literally from ground zero, being a 100% digital bank, shows that it can be done, and it's been done. And when you take a look at the experience of, in this case, ING in particular, around the world, we've seen that going direct to a digital platform is something that I guess consumers do appreciate as well as embrace. Now, the question is, do we have enough of the infrastructure to do it? So I think we're very happy to mention that, first of all, if the question is on security, meaning within our system, I think we're very proud to mention that we have global standards, and we've basically been able to use what we have learned and developed around the world to actually put it in the Philippine context. So I think that's one. The second part is that as the country actually expands and in fact increases its telecommunications infrastructure, this can only mean that it's actually good for digital players like ourselves. And we're actually very proud to be part of the, let's call it the ecosystem of digital technologies around there, because as we're part of this digital infrastructure, we can see that more and more transactions as well as more and more interactions are happening within the digital space. So being part of that infrastructure, I think, begets a much larger community of users, which begets a much larger use case for infrastructure providers to actually expand the infrastructure relating around digital transactions.
Okay, so chicken and egg, you can't really wait for that to be perfectly functioning before you start your process. What's your plan here? Are you trying to be a fintech and go into payment systems, fill in the band-aid that traditional banks haven't filled in? Are you trying to be a bank in terms of your long-term goal is to give out loans? And how do you position in this play?
Well, first of all, I'd say that interesting that you asked that question, because we've been described as being the first fintech in this space. And the first actually experiment that we had was about 20 years ago, of course, in Europe. We actually also interact with a lot of fintechs, and we're actually partnered with a few of them, as well as have developed a few in-house. So I would say that from the digital infrastructure standpoint, also the way we're looking at things, it is very much a fintech kind of atmosphere. But in terms of being a financial institution, we are a big financial institution, and we are essentially a bank, right? Which actually takes in deposits as well as loans. And I think you'll see that in the hopefully not so distant future, wherein you're able to actually borrow off your ING mobile app here in the Philippines, because we've done that in other countries that we are present in.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute left, so I'll maybe merge two questions here. What's your plan in terms of reaching rural areas? So the fintech's agenda was really in terms of financial inclusions to tap the people with the mobile phones, wherein the physical traditional banks could not make brick and mortar in these sort of areas. Is that something you're going to be rolling out here? And finally, digital tax being proposed right now. Will this not hurt the consumers' pockets, bottom line?
So first thing, we're being digital. We're essentially all around the country right now. So I'm hoping, in fact, that the data will show that we're a big player in financial inclusion. On the second question, digital tax, I would say that there's always this temptation to tax anything that seems to be new and growing, right? But I think that's probably the wrong response because you've seen, and in fact, even with the proposal of the government under the CREATE Act, wherein you're trying to reduce corporate income taxes to much more competitive levels. I think the best way to actually incentivize industries to work is actually having a low competitive tax rate rather than a high tax rate that's specific to a particular activity.
Okay, so clear position there, and also echoing the statements of central bank governors saying let's not weaken our financial institutions during this period. And we are, of course, banking on you guys to help us get through this crisis. Thank you so much. That was Hansika, Country Manager of ING. And that's a first look into the business day. Today is June 2nd, 2020, a Tuesday. Catch us again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. I'm Danie Laurel, and we are One News.